Welcome to Magnificat TV news program, dedicated to providing news of the Church. Today is Wednesday, October 25th, 2023, and these are our news. The Pope has called for a date of prayer, fasting, and penance this Friday for an end of wars, especially in Gaza and Ukraine. In 2021, the number of Catholics in the world increased, but the percentage decreased because the increase in the world population was greater than the increase in the Catholics. The conference of Monsignor Gainswain was to given in Madrid has been cancelled. Pope Benedict's secretary has asked to rectify the slanderous accusation against him. The Pope has received at the Vatican a nun who promotes the acceptance of LGBTQ people. This audience coincides with the Synod on Synodality. 5. 1, 2, 3. Dictator Ortega has expelled from Nicaragua 12 priests who had been previously imprisoned. They had been hosted by the Vatican. The Pope has asked Catholics to dedicate this Friday, the 27th, to pray for peace in Israel and Ukraine, and to unite their prayers to fasting and penance.
The victims are increasing, and the situation in Gaza is desperate. Please do everything possible to avoid a humanitarian catastrophe, the Pope said. What worries Francis is the possible escalation of the conflict, while in the world there are already so many open war fronts. Silence the weapons, listen to the cry for peace of the poor, of the people, of the children. War does not solve any problem. It only sows death and destruction. It increases hatred, multiplies revenge. War eases the future. The Pope never tires of exhorting prayer, which is, as he said on several occasions, the gentle and holy strength we have to combat hatred. Please, brothers and sisters, let us continue to pray for the peace in the world, especially in the martyred Ukraine, which is no longer spoken of, but where the drama continues. The exhortation addressed to believers is, therefore, to take only one side in this conflict, that of peace, with total prayer and dedication. Hence the decision to convene a day of prayer to be held next Friday at St. Peter's at 6 p.m., in which the members of the Synod will participate.
More Catholics, but less as percentage of the world population, and fewer priests, nuns, and seminarians.
The Vatican has published its annual statistics on the number of Catholics in the world. The number of Catholics has increased by 16.24 million to 1.375 million. This represents a percentage of 17.67% of the world's population. Compared to the previous year, the percentage of Catholics has fallen again, from 17.73% to 17.67%. The absolute number fell in Europe, a loss of 244,000. The percentage fell again for the second year in Asia, an increase in Africa, America, and Oceania. The total number of priests in the world has decreased. In 2021, there were 407,872, which is a loss of 2,347. A considerable decrease is again noted in Europe, with a loss of 3,632, to which is added in America a loss of 963. The increases are in Africa, with a gain of 1,518, Asia with a gain of 719, and Oceania with a gain of 11. The number of diocesan priests in the world has decreased, globally by 911 units, reaching 279,610, with a decrease in Europe of 2,237, and in America with a loss of 230. They increase in the other continents. In Oceania, a gain of 21. In Asia, 561, and in Africa, 974. The total number of religious priests decreased by 1,436 to 128,262. The number of diocesan and religious major seminarians was 109,895, 1,960 fewer than the previous year. The increases were recorded only in Africa, with a gain of 187. The decreases in America are of 744, in Asia of 514, in Europe of 888, and Oceania of 1.
The conference that Monsignor Gainswain was to give in Madrid has been cancelled. The bishop has asked a magazine to rectify the slanderous accusations against him.
The cancelled event was scheduled for the 18th, on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger's presentation of the new Catechism of the Catholic Church at the Spanish University Foundation. According to the foundation, the event has been suspended for organizational reasons. Several media criticized Gainswain's presence in Madrid and presented it as a show of support to those who are critical of Pope Francis. The magazine Vida Nueva affirmed that the Pope held several meetings with him in which he would have offered him to head a German diocese, following the steps of Stanislao Zizwis, personal secretary of John Paul II, who after his death was appointed Archbishop of Krakow. Gainswain, according to Vida Nueva, refused, and Francis offered him the possibility of pastoring an Italian diocese. He also rejected it, and even went so far as to run for a position of reference within the Curia. Faced with this challenge from the German Archbishop, the Pope urged him to leave the Vatican and return to his homeland. Faced with this, the secretary of the late Pope has written a letter to the editor of the magazine, in which he echoes those affirmations. With great surprise on my part, says Gainswain, I have learned that Vida Nueva digital affirmations are made regarding my person, which I am obliged to comment on, since other media are already echoing them. These statements are completely false. Please be aware that such statements constitute serious slander. For this reason, I respectfully request that such statement be rectified immediately with its due publicity.
Pope Francis had met with Sister Janine Gramac, co-founder of New Way Ministry, who was previously been admonished by the Holy See.
The Holy Father received Janine Gramac, along with 3 members of the New Way Ministry, at the Vatican for 50 minutes. The co-founder of the New Way's ministry brought greetings to Pope Francis on behalf of the LGBTQ Catholics in the U.S. She thanked him for his openness to the blessing of same-sex unions, according to the organization's own website. On May 31, 1999, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, then presided over by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, published a note about Father Robert Nugent and Sister Janine Gramac, co-founders of the New Ways Ministry, NWM, which stated, "From the beginning, in presenting the Church's doctrine on homosexuality, Father Nugent and Sister Gramac have continually questioned central elements of that doctrine. For this reason, in 1984, Cardinal Hickey, Archbishop of Washington, informed them that they could no longer continue their activities in that archdiocese. At the same time, the Congregation for Institutes of Consecrated Life and Societies of Apostolic Life ordered them to separate themselves totally and completely from New Way's ministry, adding that they could not exercise any apostolate unless they faithfully presented the Church's teaching on intrinsic evil of homosexual acts. Neither the priest nor the nun heeded what the church ordered them to do. The doctrine of the faith text indicated. Despite this intervention by the Holy See, Father Nugent and Sister Graham continued to participate in the activities organized by the New Ways Ministry, although they resigned from the positions of responsibility. In view of the failure of repeated attempts by the legitimate problems raised by the two authors, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith is compelled to declare that the position of Sister Graham and Father Nugent regarding the intrinsic evil of homosexual acts are unacceptable in doctrine.
Nicaragua dictator Ortega has expelled 12 imprisoned priests from the country and sent them to the Vatican. Monsignor Alvarez remained in jail.
The Nicaraguan dictatorship has reported the release of 12 imprisoned priests who have left the country for Rome, following an agreement made by Ortega regime with the Holy See. Monsignor Alvarez, Bishop of Matagalpa, who refuses to leave the country, remains in prison. The dictatorship statement indicates that after fruitful conversations with the Holy See, an agreement was reached for the transfer to the Vatican of 12 priests, who for different reasons were prosecuted and who have traveled to Rome. The dictator of the Vatican Press Office confirmed that the Holy See has been asked to receive the newly released priests. Upon their arrival, they have been housed in some of the premises of the Diocese of Rome, where they will await for their final destination. The document does not explain why Bishop Alvarez does not appear in the list of priests released from prison by the Nicaraguan government, which in the last year closed at least 7 radio stations and 5 universities linked to the Catholic Church, besides prohibiting processions and massive religious festivities. Monsignor Alvarez, the most critical voice of the Church against the Sandinista government, refused last February 9th to board a plane with 222 opposition members who were imprisoned and exiled to the United States. Ortega confirmed this information at the time and described the bishop as arrogant and unhinged.
Our editorial this week is dedicated to commenting on the assassinating Cardinal Miller accusation against Cardinal Fernandez, the new prefect of the Doctrine of the Faith.
The Synod continues its sessions. It is getting closer and closer to its conclusion, and it is doing it in a fairly quiet way. Although there is a prohibition for the Synod members to tell what they are talking about, there is always some news that inevitably leaks. It is logical. For example, that one of the participants received applause when he spoke positively about the acceptance that there should be in the Church to everyone and in particular to people who practice homosexuality. This is a fact that we want to present as a novelty, but that has always been absolutely true in the Church. The Church has always welcomed everyone, and of course homosexuals and practicing homosexuals as well. And if not, as some famous people, for example, if he were alive, the Italian film director Zeffirelli could speak of that wonderful film of St. Francis, or the other, On the Life of Christ, who not long before his death told his experience as a homosexual who sometimes did such acts, and yet he always felt welcomed by the Church. It is one thing to welcome people. The Church has always been open to everyone, and it is another thing to bless what these people do when what they do is wrong. There was also applause, much louder, for a laywoman who said that it was not necessary to insist so much on the subject of female priesthood because the real problems of women were quite different. The truth is that little has been said about homosexuality in minor circles, in the small working groups. Instead, much has been said about the female priesthood, starting with the diaconate. But well, it is already known that the diaconate and they themselves, those who demand it, say it is. It is only the first step to the priesthood, and then the episcopate, and then the papacy, when a woman is there. It is not that they ask for all of it at once, but it is known that this is the way to go. And this has been talked about a lot in the Synod. Of course, there is no conclusion, nor there could be. But if things are quite calm in the Synod, the same is not happening outside. The letter that Cardinal Mueller, former prefect of the Doctrine of the Faith, wrote to Cardinal Duca, Archbishop Emeritus of Prague, regarding the answer that Cardinal Fernandez, current prefect of the Doctrine of Faith, addressed to Cardinal Duca, answering his standubia, especially those referring to the communion of the divorced and remarried. Obviously, divorced and remarried without having obtained the marriage nullity is still being commented on. Cardinal Fernandez tells Cardinal Duca that following what was approved by the ecclesiastical province of Buenos Aires and ratified by the Pope, every divorced and remarried person can discern, accompanied by a priest, and knowing what the doctrine of the Church says, can discern for himself whether he can or not receive communion, and that the priest who has to give him communion cannot refuse it. Well, Cardinal Mueller writes to Cardinal Duca and tells him that his teaching of the current doctrine of the faith is in contradiction with the teaching of the two previous popes on the same subject, St. John Paul II and Benedict XVI, and that when there is an evident contradiction between two teachings of the magisterium, one can deny in conscience adherence to one of them, in this case of the recent one of Cardinal Fernandez. Cardinal Mueller also says, Monsignor Mueller says, the response of the doctrine of the faith, this is very serious, confirms that the magisterium of Francis expressly contradicts the magisterium of the popes who preceded him. It is a very strong accusation, and it also contradicts the teachings belonging to the deposit of faith, such as those issued at the Council of Trent. Along with this accusation, Mueller makes another, referring to what Fernandez has also said in his reply to Duca, saying that each episcopal conference now has to establish the conditions for priests to give communion to the divorced and remarried, although the last word in each diocese will be up to the bishop. On this, Mueller says, in view of this, a conclusion spontaneously arises. If the orientations are different, it will be the case that some divorced persons will be able to receive the Eucharist according to the lines of one diocese, and not according to the lines of another. And he concludes with a never-before-heard accusation. Therefore, that a person can receive communion in one local church and cannot receive a communion in another is an exact definition of schism. A former prefect of the Doctrine of the Faith accuses his successors at the head of the Doctrine of Faith of somehow promoting schism because he says that in one diocese a person can receive communion and in a neighboring diocese in the next village many times he can no longer receive communion, and this contradicts the unity of the Church based on the Eucharist. This is a schism, and a schism is being promoted. These are very harsh accusations of Cardinal Mueller that are being debated. I do not say within the Synod, perhaps more in the coffee breaks, but certainly outside of the Synod. Very serious and grave accusations. There are drums of war in the Church. But these are not the only drums of war. Even more serious, at least in another order, are those of Israel and the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. With the weapons available at the moment, and if the war spreads, the whole humanity could be devastated, everything could be destroyed, and we could all be destroyed. The situation is extremely serious, and for this reason the Pope has called for a day of prayer, fasting, and penance for Friday, the 27th, to ask God to stop the wars, including the one in Ukraine, to ask God for the gift of peace. It seems to me an extraordinary and timely initiative which I fully support. Our main weapon this moment is prayer. We believe in it, and we have to get down on our knees before the Lord begging for the gift of peace, begging that the leaders of the nations be aware of the seriousness of the moment, and of what can happen if each one does what he thinks he should do and just starts throwing bombs at the others. Peace is necessary. Prayer for peace is necessary. There will be diplomatic initiatives that are already being taken, but we have to pray for peace. And while we are at it, and I think it's very good that the Pope has included prayer for peace and fasting and also penance, I think we should all examine our conscience about our contribution to the war. I'm not referring to the terrible, dreadful war in Israel and Gaza. By the way, I insist that the attacks of the terrorist group Hamas on Israel have no justification whatsoever, and they have to be condemned in an unequivocal way. But I repeat, we also have to pray for peace, so that what may happen will not be worse than what's already happened. And we have to examine our conscience to analyze what has been our contribution to the war. For example, if we are able to forgive our enemies we speak, while with reason of the teachings of Christ, for example, about adultery. He who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against the first. But we forget that there are other teachings of Christ, that they are very clear, and that the Lord repeats them, for example, in the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us as we forgive. And at the end of saying the prayer, Jesus insists, which means that he gives enormous importance to it. If we do not forgive, if you do not forgive your enemies, you will not be forgiven. It is not enough to pray for peace far away. It must also be converted from the contributions that each one makes to the war, because one does not forgive one's enemies from the heart. One piece of news to finish. 10 priests from Nicaragua has been released by the dictatorial regime of Ortega in that country and have traveled to the Vatican. It is good news as far as the release of 10 priests who are unjustly imprisoned is concerned. And it's not good news because it carries with it that the dictator is once again getting rid of those he considers his opponents. Although the opposition these priests may have made may have been as minimal as making a procession in the streets without permission. Let us pray. Let us pray for peace in the Church, for these drums of war that sound, so that the Church may always be faithful to the teachings of Jesus Christ. Let us pray for the Pope in such a delicate moment, because he is the vicar of Christ. Let us pray for peace in the world. We join the Holy Father in this call to prayer, fasting, and penance on the 27th. Until next week, God willing.
Up to this point, we have presented our news, but if you want to continue to be updated, you can do it on our website, www.magnificat.tv. See you next week, God willing.